When a person does gain weight, it's in the presence of a damaged, dysbiotic gut. And there are these three mechanisms: the satiety hormones, our insulin resistance, and the release of bacterial endotoxin that are taking place as a result of these changes that are occurring within the gut microbiome. And the solution has to do in part with restoring healthy levels of the short-chain fatty acids by properly fueling our gut.
You're a very, very experienced and renowned gastroenterologist. Like, this is your specialty. This is where you live. You know more about the gut and the gastrointestinal system than damn near anybody on the planet. And there are so many different dimensions of what our gut health influences in other aspects of our lives. And so today I want to ask you about how can poor gut health possibly lead to weight gain?
Yeah, if you asked me this 15 years ago, I would have said, look, it's just calories in, calories out. It's just addition and subtraction. And, as long as you stay below that certain limit, then you shouldn't have a problem. Clearly, it's more complicated than that. Look at what's happening in the United States today. 75% of the United States is overweight. 40% of America is obese right now. Our kids, childhood obesity, like skyrocketing, going off the roof. What is going on? And part of our understanding of what's happening is actually in the gut microbiome. Now, I'm not here to tell you that this is the only thing that matters. It's not. But this is part of the equation. And if we want to properly understand our metabolism, then we need to understand our gut microbiome. It goes back to, Shawn, some of the breakthrough studies from about 15 years ago, the very first, sort of eye-opening, whoa, what is happening here? Studies that were taking place with the gut were actually in this space. And what they did was they would transplant the gut microbiome from an obese mouse into a different mouse, and that mouse would become obese. So you could transfer weight gain or a body habitus from animal to animal. And they kept kind of leveling this up. They showed that you could do this from skinny mouse to skinny mouse. And then they said, you know what? Let's try this, transferring the microbiome of humans into mice. But here's the deal. Let's try this where we take actually identical human twins. So they have the exact same genetic code. Yet one of them is obese and one of them is lean. And let's transfer from these two humans who have the same genetic code but different body habitus into these mice. And what they found is that when you transfer the microbiome from an obese human into a mouse, that mouse becomes obese. When you transfer from a lean human into a mouse, that mouse becomes lean. And this is despite consuming the exact same number of calories. This is not just calories in and calories out. Shawn, in animal agriculture, in the United States at least, it is common practice for the animals, the livestock, to receive antibiotics. This is part of conventional farming. 80% of the antibiotics in the United States are not given to humans. They're given to animals. And the reason that this is done, we could pretend that it's to prevent infections. These animals gain 15% more weight being fed the exact same food, the exact same number of calories, when you treat the animal with an antibiotic. Further evidence that by disrupting and damaging the gut microbiome, that you can actually affect metabolism and weight balance. And so if we start and accept this, that gut microbiome is part of the story here, all right? If we all mutually agree to accept that microbiome is part of the story when it comes to metabolism and weight gain or weight balance, then let me bring forward 3 ways that I see in the scientific literature playing out that I believe are creating this connection and explaining why this is. Number 1, You wrote about in your book, Shawn, Eat Smarter, you wrote about satiety hormones, things like ghrelin, peptide YY, all right? These are the hormones that are critical to us as humans to let us know when we are full so that we stop eating and we don't overeat. And what's interesting is that there is evidence to suggest that the gut microbiome plays a critical role in controlling the release of these satiety hormones. To be a little more specific for the nerds at home, or for the people who have read my book Fiber Fueled, you will know that I am a big fan of this one particular biochemical, or I should say family of biochemicals, called short-chain fatty acids. Now, short-chain fatty acids do not exist without our gut microbes. So anytime I talk about short-chain fatty acids, you know I'm talking about the gut microbiome because they're the ones who create them. And they create them from dietary fiber. And what we have seen, Shawn, is that short-chain fatty acids actually are the linchpin in terms of controlling and regulating these satiety hormones. That was number one. Here's number two. Let's talk about a topic that you talked about in your book and that I know that you've talked about quite a bit on your show, which is insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is the underpinning of type 2 diabetes. It's actually the underpinning of many different conditions, including, like in my space as a gastroenterologist, I take care of people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This, by the way, is soon to become the #1 cause of cirrhosis in the United States. It's going to pass hepatitis C. Well, insulin resistance is the cause of these problems. Insulin resistance, let me just say, is proof of a damaged metabolism. When your metabolism is not working properly, this is what you get. You get insulin resistance. And when it comes to insulin resistance, there are many different factors that play into this, but one of the critical factors, again, is the gut microbiome. They have done studies, Shawn, where they take humans, these are not animal studies, humans, and they transfer the gut microbiome of a person who has insulin resistance into adult men. And these adult men get insulin resistance. It only sticks around for a few weeks because then their gut microbiome starts to revert back to what they were before. But the point being that insulin resistance is something that is related to our gut microbiome. And by the way, in studies, they did this one study, Shawn, where they took kids and they looked at what happens when you put kids at a buffet. All right, so you take these kids and take them to like OCB, if that even exists anymore. And
Ryan's, there was did you guys have a
we had Old
Ryan's?
Country Buffet.
Well, that sounds nicer, but we had Ryan's was like the
Was
place
that
to
St.
go.
Louis?
I mean, and the combinations of foods that people eat is insane. I know being a kid, you get to just get what you want. I'm getting some
Ah,
shrimp, I'm getting some spaghetti, I'm getting some ice
yeah.
cream. You can get your own ice cream as a kid. Are you kidding me? Like it's
We also
crazy.
had Ponderosa. Did you guys have Ponderosa?
Ponderosa,
Oh man, I
yes.
love
Oh
that place.
yeah, Ponderosa.
Yeah,
Yeah, that they had all you can eat shrimp.
yeah,
I remember that. So just give me my fried shrimp and a bottle of Heinz, and it's
yeah.
on. I remember one time the lady came to the table, the waitress. She just knew that we were like stuffing shrimp into my mother's bag or something, but it was just going all into this little, less than 100 pound little kid, this elementary school kid. I was just shoveling it down,
Right.
man. Those were the days. But now, of course, like a lot of folks know, there's casinos all over the place. Like people go for the
Yeah.
buffets. So it's an American
Some people
phenomenon.
fly to Vegas not for the casinos, but for the buffets.
That's right. That's right.
Um, well, so anyway, they did this interesting study with kids, and insulin resistance again, like this is basically when I say this is the underpinning of type 2 diabetes, and type 2 diabetes is unfortunately like massively on the rise in our kids right now. And so they put a group of children in a buffet and they saw what would happen. And what they discovered is that the people who have insulin resistance, the kids who had insulin resistance, were the ones who were overeating. Those were the ones who were consuming more. Perhaps because they weren't getting enough of those satiety hormones to know when to stop. But the point being that with a dysregulated metabolism, a metabolism out of balance, these kids were basically like the ones who were setting themselves up for weight gain by overeating. So, and the third thing, Shawn, I should mention real quick before I move on to the third thing that I mentioned short chain fatty acids before. Short chain fatty acids come from our gut microbiome. They're the product of when we consume dietary fiber. And they've actually shown through mechanistic studies that these short chain fatty acids, they are actually the solution to insulin resistance. I don't want to bore your listeners with all of the details of lipotoxicity and insulin resistance. It gets pretty technical. But if you really dig into this and you look at this, what you will discover is that short chain fatty acids have the ability to reverse insulin resistance. So once again, the gut microbiome. And the third thing that I would bring up is damage to the gut microbiome, which produces what we describe as endotoxemia. Our microbes produce something called bacterial endotoxin. And that bacterial endotoxin is not supposed to be entering into our bloodstream in large amounts. But when you injure the gut microbiome and you enter it into a state of what we describe as dysbiosis, dysbiosis meaning an unbalanced, damaged gut microbiome, which, by the way, is what you see in a person with obesity. This gut microbiome has what we describe as leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability. The barriers to leakage in the intestinal wall pop open and create a channel where things can start to spill through. And what spills through is this bacterial endotoxin. Bacterial endotoxin is the direct result of microbes living inside of our gut. And what we have discovered is that bacterial endotoxin is essentially synonymous with inflammation. People wonder where inflammation comes from. I'm describing it to you right now. Damage to the gut with the release of bacterial endotoxin into the bloodstream. When a person comes in super sick to the hospital, regardless of the cause, if they come in with sepsis, high heart rate, low blood pressure, they're really not conscious, they're completely delirious, and they're breathing about 30 times a minute, and they need to be put on a ventilator immediately. This person with septic shock, what's happened is that this infection has overwhelmed their system and caused the release of bacterial endotoxin. Well, the point with bacterial endotoxin, getting back to obesity, is that if you inject bacterial endotoxin into an animal, it will become obese. And the reason why has to do with activating these inflammatory pathways. When you take a human being and you discover that they have damage to their gut microbiome, dysbiosis, they release this bacterial endotoxin, and we can correlate with bacterial endotoxin to weight gain. We're showing that there's yet another pathway. So the bottom line, Shawn, is that I think that the science is very clear at this point that the gut microbiome is a critical piece of how we can potentially gain weight. When a person does gain weight, it's in the presence of a damaged, dysbiotic gut. And there are these three mechanisms: the satiety hormones, our insulin resistance, and the release of bacterial endotoxin that are taking place as a result of these changes that are occurring within the gut microbiome. And the solution to bring us back has to do in part with restoring healthy levels of the short chain fatty acids by properly fueling our gut.
This is beyond powerful because this is starting to shift our knowledge base from, as you mentioned, you came into this saying, listen, calories matter, but this idea that the human body is a calculator is a problem. And we're not looking at what is actually, it's more like a really hyper intelligent chemistry lab. And we're not looking at what are the underlying mechanisms, what are the underlying pieces that are controlling what calories do in our bodies, and bring it to light. And I love this because we have not talked about this in depth at all. In the we're at 8 years now. I think we're knocking on the door, maybe 9 years of the show, talking about endotoxemia, and starts to answer the question, okay, so what's going on here? Are this certain bacteria cascade, are they grabbing more of these calories and shuttling them into our circulation? Is that part of the equation? Sure, that might play a role. But I think a better thing to kind of shed light on this is what happens when our bacteria are grabbing up some of these abnormal food products? What kind of metabolic waste are they creating? Because it's not just the fact that this Twinkie is nothing that humans have ever eaten before in human history and just like it's made up of all this totally fake stuff. What does your body, what do your cells and your bacteria cells produce as a result? And what does what is the effect that has on our metabolism? And that is really bringing to light a huge part of this equation that's not talked about enough.
Yeah, totally. I feel like one of the things that's misunderstood about the gut microbiome that I would like to try to correct for people is that ultimately it's not just the bugs. The bugs matter, but really what it is it's this combination of what you give to the bugs to work with, and then the bugs that are there. They're like the chefs. They're not magicians. They're not making something out of nothing. But if you give them the ingredients and you got the right chefs, they'll make you a fantastic meal. You give them junk ingredients and you hire some kid who it doesn't want to be there and is trying to get and sneak out and he's not responsible at all, and that's your gut microbiome, they're not going to produce something that's high quality for you. So what we want is we want to get the proper balance, not only by getting the right gut bugs, but we also want to empower those gut bugs by giving them high quality ingredients to work with.
Yes, it's so obviously we've talked about this a little bit, and I want to dabble on it here. But one of the foundational things in our culture currently, unfortunately, is that we're providing for our gut bugs and for our our human tissues. Period, is a rampant amount of sugar. And sugar has just been it's become this is it's become synonymous with something really bad, and I think that is a limited perspective because sugar exists in nature as well, and it has throughout our evolution, but it's just this Frankenstein situation that we've gotten into with sugar and isolating it into this one thing. And now we've got all these different variations of what sugar can look like as well. And the pure amount that humans are consuming now, we're talking about around 70 pounds a year for the average American. And that's a person. That's like a whole, like that kid when I was sitting at Ponderosa, like that was my weight.
Right.
Like that much sugar in a year, it can create some abnormalities, obviously, with our microbiome. So let's talk about that a little bit in how sugar is one of the things that's wreaking havoc with our microbes.
Yeah, totally. I think it's important, you alluded to this, but I think it's important to first make sure that we separate and make the distinction between refined, ultra processed foods, products, things that don't naturally occur in nature, but that require us to basically go into a food science lab, figure out how to make something happen. Food scientists spend 18 months working on a project, figuring how to create something, and then we then ship it off to the manufacturer or some sort of chemical plant, and they then do this on mass scale. This is radically different than talking about unrefined, simple sugars that exist in natural foods. Now, I'm not here to argue in favor of a fruit-only diet. That would be ridiculous, and I don't agree with any diet that is so hyper restrictive. But I also don't think that calling fruit the problem because it happens to contain sugar makes much sense. Because we were talking before about insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Guess what happens when people consume more fruit? They're less likely to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. What happens to people's weight when they consume more fruit? They lose weight. They're not gaining weight because of the fruit they eat. They're gaining weight because of the processed food they eat. So it's important to make this distinction up front, because things like fructose that exist in fruits is very different than the fructose that exists in high fructose corn syrup. And so when it comes to these, distilled, refined ingredients, we're finding them predominantly in ultra-processed foods. Unfortunately, these ultra-processed foods make up about 60% of the calories in the American diet. They're devoid of fiber, they're devoid of nutrients, they're jacked up not just with sugar. There's an entire vehicle that is carrying the sugar, and it's carrying a whole bunch of other bombs that you don't want to be dropping into your gut. That's what ultra-processed foods are, and we can dig into that more. I think we probably will in a few minutes. But when we focus on the sugar itself for a moment, what we do know is this, that the effect of simple refined sugars on the gut microbiome is an inflammatory effect. Every dietary choice that we make, Shawn, is leading to the rise and fall of specific families of microbes. Some of them get fed and some of them don't, based upon our dietary choices. When we choose simple refined sugars, we are choosing to feed the inflammatory microbes. It tastes great for 30 seconds. And then you hit that sugar crash and you feel horrible. And you realize this was probably a mistake, yet we go back and we do it again because there's that addictive potential. So I think that the point from my perspective with these sugars is that they're causing harm to our gut microbiome. Let's not make any mistake about that. And when we're talking about 70 pounds of these sugars per year, that's disturbing.
Yeah. And by the way, that's added sugars. It's 70 pounds of added sugar. That's not even counting the naturally occurring sugar in foods and, the refined carbohydrates and the like that folks are consuming. So, we're not in a good space right now. And again, it's not hard to just use our eyeballs and look around at our society and see that. And this is part of the issue. And it's not just as simple as like, this person's just eating too much sugar. They need to, ratchet it back a bit. It's what is this doing to the composition of your microbiome? Is it creating a composition to where your metabolism is literally changed and it's making this greater propensity towards you being insulin resistant, towards weight gain and the like? And, this is really, and this, like, again, this is your life and your livelihood and your passion, that this world inside of our bodies is so miraculous and has so many impacts on other things in our lives. And I want to dig in just a little bit more and talk about, so we dabbled in sugar a little bit. And I want to make sure folks also listen to your first appearance on the show. We went through the different types of microbes that live in and on our bodies. And we talked about sugar as well. But what are some of the other things? Because we're looking at a situation where sugar is, and these hyperpalatable, hyperprocessed, ultra-processed foods, essentially feeding abnormal bacteria, feeding what's considered to be more of the unfriendly or pathogenic bacteria, which everything has its place, but it starts to create dysbiosis. Because if we're not feeding our probiotic or friendly flora, the right stuff, they're just not going to be able to stick around because they don't have their food source. So we know that with sugar, but what are some of the other things that folks might not realize, that folks are commonly eating or interacting with, that could be damaging their microbiome, that could be damaging their gut health?
Yeah. Before we even jump into that, I just want to start by pointing out what is good for our gut microbiome. And you and I both said the exact same thing in our books, which is that we need to feed the probiotic healthy microbes inside of us. We need to make sure that they are getting fed. And we live in a society, Shawn, where the average man is consuming 18 grams of fiber per day when we should be getting 38. The average woman is consuming 15 grams of fiber when she should be getting 25. This is our most pressing nutritional deficiency right now, and fiber is the fuel for these microbes. This is what they want. This is what they thrive on. This is what they use to produce the short chain fatty acids that we were talking about. So I think it's important to start with this as a point of reference. And the reason that I'm pointing this out is that me personally, I'm about trying to encourage people to run to the foods that heal. I don't want to create demons. I don't want to create monsters. I do want to be honest. I do want to be honest and tell you which foods can be problematic. We're not going to pretend that every single food is just the same. They're not. That's ridiculous. But I also want to create an environment where it's about positivity. It's about like basically having a mindset where you gravitate towards those foods that heal. And to me, that means focusing on eating a wide variety of plants. The exact same thing that you said in your book, eating a broad diversity. When you eat a broad diversity of plants, you get all the different colors, you get all the different forms of fiber, and all the good microbes, they all get to eat. That's what we want. So, flip side, what are the things that I'm just kind of like, okay, in moderation, there's a place, right? Let's not be like too hard on ourselves. There's no such thing as a perfect diet, but like, what are the things that I kind of pump the brakes on? I would seriously start with ultra processed foods, clearly. And part of that is this is 60% of the American diet.
That's insane. That's insane. And I get put my hand up because that was me
Yeah,
as well.
that was me
Yeah.
too. There I was, in my early 30s. Here I am 10 years later, but there I was in my early 30s, 50 pounds overweight. And it's because I was opting for convenience, because convenience was what I felt I needed at that point in my life because I was working so hard. So these foods are convenient, and that's part of the reason why they're popular. They're also hyperpalatable. You consume them and you want more. They don't make
Yeah.
you feel well,
And they're cheap.
and they're
You know,
cheap.
for you, convenience. For me, it was cost and taste. So that hyperpalatability and the fact that they're so cheap.
This is part of the issue. This is part of the issue is that our food system, we subsidize these foods and we make the ultra processed foods inexpensive. And then people of lower socioeconomic status are choosing what they can afford. And guess what? If it tastes good, of course, that's what I'm going to do. It's less expensive and it tastes good. And we end up in a situation where these people unfortunately pay the price later on with their health, which is not fair. And so, with regard to ultra processed foods and the gut microbiome specifically, if we zoom in and we look at what's happening, what we discover is that, first of all, there are 10,000 additives in our food supply. The FDA has a special loophole called the GRAS, generally recognized as safe, that allows them to approve these food chemicals without human studies.
Right.
And even the ones that do have human studies, it's like, let's give 20 people this for 10 days. Cool, they're still alive. We don't need to do any more. We've done our work here. We've proven safety. It's like, hold on, what happens when people are eating 60% of their diet from this stuff day over day, year over year, decade over decade? And we destroy our gut microbiome because while I'm not here to say that every single food additive is inherently bad, that would be ridiculous. But we don't know.
Right.
And there are 10,000 of them. And some of them are proving to be bad. Things like carboxymethylcellulose, which if you start picking up the packages in your supermarket, you're going to see this word, carboxymethylcellulose, major disruptor of your gut. Polysorbate 80 is another example. And, Shawn, it's who's going to pay for the research to study these additives? The food industry is not. Why would they undermine their own business? And we've already approved them. They're already in the food supply, and it's really hard to walk it back. And even when you find evidence that makes guys like you and I disturbed, the FDA doesn't step in and intervene. So the point from my perspective is not to be like fear mongering. The point from my perspective is to be honest. and say that I am concerned that ultra processed foods are unhealthy and disruptive to our gut microbiome. And for that reason, I'm of the belief that at a minimum, we should be reducing our consumption. And in a perfect world, and by the way, I am not perfect, but we should be striving to reduce them as much as possible, ideally to none, to be totally honest with you. So I would start with ultra processed foods. Anything you want to add to that, Shawn?
Of course, like, listen, this one here, if we just address this one thing, we're going to have a revolution with our health, period. And this doesn't mean you can't have a donut or whatever. It's just like making that a smaller percentage of your diet. And you just said another reason why. These things, 10,000 approved additives for food, newly invented chemical compilations, and getting this loophole for them to be in our system, in our food system, this GRAS system, this generally regarded as safe, and understanding it is, first of all, it's incredibly difficult for data to be done, for studies to be done, for funding to be given to prove that they're bad for us, right? That's the burden is on us to try to prove that they're bad for us instead of it coming into the situation where they're proving that they're good for us. That should have been done in the first place. Proving, having clear evidence that these things are not harmful to humans and or good for us, but at least not harmful to us. But that's not being done. And so we are truly a social experiment when we're interacting with these processed foods. We have no idea what this is doing to our microbes, what it's doing to our thyroid, what it's doing to, our meniscus in our knee. We don't have any idea the impact these things are having. For the most part, and again, in recent years, we've had enough, some researchers taking the time, scrounging around to get a few dollars of funding to find out, like you mentioned, polysorbate 80,
Right.
for example, and just like, or, this various food dyes, one of these red food dyes,
Right.
have these clear implications with contributions to ADHD in children,
Right.
right? It takes all of this work. But then we think about how many years have people been consuming this stuff? How many people have been harmed? And so that's going to lead me into asking you about another one. And I'm just going to pitch it out there to you.
Okay.
What about pesticides, rodenticides, herbicides?
That's actually where I was going to go next, to be totally honest with you, being completely serious. So, we in the United States have very open policies when it comes to the spraying of our food with herbicides. And one specifically that I'm concerned about is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient that you will find in Roundup, being sprayed by the millions of kilograms in the United States and the millions of kilograms in Canada. These are practices that are actually being made illegal in Europe as we speak. Like Germany, for example, by 2023 will not allow this at all. Yet in our food supply, this is being done to many different types of foods. A few of the common ones: soy, corn, and we have to be very cautious with our whole grains. Now, one of the important points is that if you can purchase organic, then organic is by definition not sprayed with glyphosate. They're not allowed to do that. But let me just kind of talk about wheat for a moment, Shawn. So I think many people who know me or have read my book know that I have a unique position when it comes to wheat. I'm not trying to be unique. I'm just telling everyone what I see when I look at the science, which is that I think that we've gone a little too far in terms of vilifying gluten, to be honest with you. Now, gluten in a person who has celiac disease is clearly a problem. But is it really so bad for me to eat a slice of a really nice sourdough bread? Am I really causing harm to myself in doing that? Do I think that sourdough bread should be the backbone of our diet? Absolutely not. But I also don't believe that we're causing any harm at all. I think that the fiber and the prebiotic compounds in that slice of sourdough outweigh any concerns that exist with gluten. But this is the important point that I want to make, which is that do I feel that there are problems with wheat Yes. Do I feel that there are some justifiable problems with whole grains? Yes. I just think that we are reacting to what we see occurring to some people when they consume these foods, or how we personally feel when we consume these foods. And I think there's something going on there. And the point from my perspective is I think it's actually this. I think it's that we're spraying our wheat with glyphosate, which is a desiccant used to dry out the wheat. That accelerates our process. When you harvest the wheat, you spray it with the glyphosate, it dries out faster, and you move on. And I'm concerned that this is actually the cause of the problems that exist with these types of foods. When you have wheat that is not organic, is being sprayed with glyphosate. When you have whole grains that are not organic, they're being sprayed with glyphosate. And this causes issues and is disruptive to our gut microbiome. The research is emerging, Shawn. The first study that came out looked at the microbiome of bees, like honeybees. But we have new studies in humans that are suggesting to us that glyphosate does indeed cause harm to the microbes in our gut. And so for that reason, from my perspective, I buy organic whenever possible. And I'm happy to talk more about some of the approaches that I take to make it more cost friendly. But the point being that that's part of the reason why I do it.
So good. You know, this is a new phenomenon. Glyphosate is a new thing in human consumption, of course, but it's been going on for years now. But it's just a tiny sentence in the evolution of humans to have exposure to something like this. And so we know that there's going to be some implications with damaging our microbiome, which again, at least to this cascade of other problems. And so folks to be mindful of that. And also, as you know, I wrote about this in Eat Smarter too. I had a little subsection that was titled, when it comes to bread, there's two sides to every slice,
Yeah,
and looking at the pros and cons, because we're not here to villainize things. Even with both of us, we're like, even with these hyper palatable processed foods, like, listen, you're not going to die, it's okay. But we need to put this in a proper perspective because we know what that does, And so, but another one of these that I've been mentioning this whenever I get the opportunity, and just being able to talk with you is definitely a good time. But chlorpyrifos is another pesticide widely used for many, many years. And it's been in and out of litigation. Right now it's caught up in red tape because it was going to be banned here because of the well-noted damage that it's been doing to the female reproductive cycle and causing deformities in children, miscarriages in pregnant workers who were exposed to chlorpyrifos. But most notably, there's a peer-reviewed study that we'll put for everybody in the show notes. There's a peer-reviewed study indicating that chlorpyrifos literally disrupts our microbial gene expression. So not only are we talking about our human genes, but our trillions of bacteria that we have, they have their own genes as well. And if we're going gene for gene, 99% of the genes we carry is microbial.
right.
And this stuff has been found to cause disruption to the expression of our microbes' genes. What does that do to our expression? And so taking this into consideration and why, first of all, why was it put into circulation in the first place? And now that we have this data, why is it still going on? And the bottom line is, and we talked about this before we even got started, the bottom line is these organizations are making money from it. They found these systems, they've been able to penny pinch and find a way to provide these foods for themselves, the production cost as low as possible, and make the greatest return on these things. And these processed food companies, their goal is not to give you great health. That's not what they're setting out to do. They're there to move products.
Right. That's what the CEO is judged on. The CEO of these companies is going to be judged on dollars and cents. They're trying to make as much as possible. And when you can create an arrangement that allows for mass distribution of your products, it's all about scale. It's all about scale. So if you can create more scale for your product by having mainstream use of genetically modified seeds, or the use of this in the food industry on wheat, then that's how you get rich.
If it don't make dollars, then it don't make sense. That's the mantra. So I want to ask you about this because, again, and first I want to pitch you this question. firsthand, and I know the answer to this already, but seeing these conditions rise in recent years. But I know that a lot of folks are struggling with this. This can be some of the most difficult. It's really a nuisance in people's lives. It's difficult to deal with, a lot of suffering involved. Issues like Crohn's, issues like colitis. Number one, have you seen those firsthand? You know, you're there doing this work, seeing these issues increase in recent years. And what are some of the underlying causes that are the contributing factors to the increased incidence of these issues that folks might not realize?
So Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and I think this in a way almost opens up into a larger conversation about autoimmune type issues, or what I would describe as chronic inflammatory conditions. So uh, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are things that I treat in my clinic routinely. I see patients every single week that have these conditions. I just wanted to describe briefly what they are for people who may be at home wondering about this. We describe these two conditions, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, as inflammatory bowel diseases. Inflammatory bowel diseases. And the reason that they exist is that our immune system actually goes on the attack. But it's not actually attacking us, which is kind of interesting, Shawn. So a lot of people believe that these are autoimmune issues. Believe it or not, they're not actually autoimmune. They're actually attacking our microbiome, which technically is not part of us, but it kind of is. And the fallout is that this war that takes place where our immune system is going to war against our gut microbiome, well, there's going to be some fallout. The fallout is inflammation that exists, like literally exists within your digestive system as ulceration, bleeding, redness. And I see it during a colonoscopy. And these two types, ulcerative colitis by definition is only in the colon. All right, so during a colonoscopy, you will see it there. Whereas Crohn's disease is a little bit different, and Crohn's disease can be different for different people because it can involve anywhere from the lips all the way down to the bottom. But it's again an inflammatory condition motivated by the immune system attacking the microbiome. These things are massively on the rise, Shawn. Massively on the rise. And they're not the only ones. There are many others. I see way more celiac disease today than I used to. There's a new condition called microscopic colitis that like literally basically didn't exist when you and I were kids. And now I'm diagnosing it literally every week. So things are definitely changing. And they actually have some data out of Minnesota where they looked at a community where it was like a community that didn't really move around much. And they tracked them from the 1940s moving forward. And what they discovered is that from the 1940s up to the late 1980s, early 1990s, they had more than a tenfold increase in these conditions during that period of time. So like 50 years, tenfold increase. And we're seeing the same thing happen actually in third world countries as they industrialize. So places like Brazil, China, they never had these issues until now. As they have industrialized, they've started to see the emergence of these inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Where does it come from? Clearly, it is not exclusively genetics. Because when you see diseases emerge this rapidly, half of a century, that's not changes in our genetic code. Our code doesn't change that quickly. That is not evolution. Something has changed in our environment, and these are environmental influences. Is there a genetic element? Of course there is a genetic element. There are people who have families where there are multiple family members that have these conditions. So this part of it is genetics, but this is not purely explained by genetics. And it's not so simple as, hey, check a gene and see if it's there, and that will tell you whether or not this person is going to develop Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. That doesn't exist. So it's an environmental thing. Now, what is it? What is it in our environment? Well, look, I kind of have already alluded to this, which is that the immune system is attacking your microbiome. So this is a change in the microbiome. So let's think about the things that can leave an imprint or cause a change to the gut microbiome. And the number one thing is food. The number one thing is food. And then we can go beyond food. I'll come back to food in a moment, but we can go beyond food and look at other things that exist within our lifestyle. These conditions we see more frequently in people who live in cities, urban environments. We see these conditions more frequently in people who come from a very sterile environment, very sterile background. So what I'm talking about is people that did not have pets when they were kids, people that did not have siblings when they were kids. So like if you had brothers and sisters, if you had pets as a kid, you are actually less likely to be diagnosed with these conditions. Think about the world that we live in, Shawn. The things that we put on our body when we take a shower, the things that we swallow that are in our food system that you and I have already talked about, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Think about the, water supply and how that's changed. Think about how much our life is different today compared to the life that our great-grandparents lived 100 years ago. We hop in our car, drive where we need to go, right? We consume this hyper-sterile food. We don't come into contact with animals. We spend no time outdoors. We do not exercise. We watch television. Or we check our phones all day, right? Like, times have changed a lot. And this is probably part of the explanation. When a person is diagnosed with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, I want them to know that, like, you didn't do something wrong. You, by living in the United States, are at increased risk of being diagnosed with these conditions. And you could do everything right, and it could still happen. Now, with that being said, there are definitely some dietary elements that we believe are a part of this story. It's a little bit tough, Shawn, because we're talking about conditions that ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, between 1 in 5,000 and 1 in 10,000 people per year will be diagnosed with one of these conditions. 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 10,000. That's not a ton of people being diagnosed every year. It's a lot more than it used to be. But because it's such a rare condition, it makes it a little bit hard to study. Because like a lot of times the studies that we will do, like you're not going to do a randomized controlled dietary study to see who gets Crohn's disease, right? You would need 1 million people to do that. That's impossible. So most of the studies that we have to be very cautious in the way that we interpret them. And the reason why is because a person gets diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and then we ask them, so what were you eating? And there can be a bias that comes from that. Like, I just got diagnosed with this condition, so I'm going to say that this is what I was eating because I'm worried that that's what caused it, So nonetheless, here's what we do see. Multiple studies have consistently shown that dietary fiber is protective. And the mechanism makes sense. Dietary fiber comes into contact with gut microbes that produce short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. So that part, I believe, and I feel that we can lean into that with confidence. More recently, there was a study that came out suggesting that ultra-processed foods are substantially increasing our risk of developing inflammatory bowel diseases. Here we go again. And specifically in that study, they were talking about polysorbate 80.
Wow.
Carboxymethylcellulose. And you and I are talking about these, but yet there's definitely other parts of the food system that we just don't know about yet. So we're talking about what we do know. There's so much that we don't know. But yet, when you look at this class of foods, they appear to be problematic. And there's also been concern, Shawn, with omega-6 fats and inflammatory oils. And it speaks to fried foods. There's a lot of fried food consumption in our society, and there was a signal that came out of a recent study, and there was a prior study in 2011 where it was suggested that the omega-6s may be problematic. Going beyond this, whether or not saturated fats and meat consumption are driving this issue, the way that I interpret the studies is this. I don't think that we should be consuming these foods to excess. Can we consume them in balance with a predominantly plant-based diet and have a healthy diet that reduces our likelihood of developing these conditions? 100%. So I think it's important to like kind of see the full picture. Here's the pie as it currently exists. The current pie is sliced up where only 10% of our calories are coming from plants, 60% are coming from ultra processed foods, and 30% are coming from animal products like meat and dairy. So what I'm just saying is 90% of the pie right now does not include fiber. And I would like to see it shift towards a pie where most of the pie is food that contains fiber. And with what's left over, say the last 10 or 20%, you can do whatever the heck you want. And because you run a plant predominant diet, it's a healthy diet.
You know what? This is so simple, and it boggles my mind. And you being somebody who's an expert in this field, where we have folks experiencing these really devastating conditions with their gastrointestinal tract, and the way that our system of training for very intelligent, very altruistic people who are wanting to help these folks to find solutions, they're trained to target the symptoms, and oftentimes don't even connect the fact that we're literally trying to treat the gastrointestinal tract, not putting the connective tissue together, that what I'm putting into the gastrointestinal tract through my food, what I'm eating, is causing the problem.
Right.
And this was a big revelation that you had, in a shift in your practice and just your life period, when you realize, like, wait a minute, what we're putting in here, like, it's directly in the environment. You said this multiple times, the environment is causing these issues. And so instead of symptoms management and attacking symptoms, which again, we want solutions, we want to feel good, we want to get relief. But if we don't remove the underlying cause of what's, the underpinning of the increases in colitis and Crohn's, and we're still trying to figure out what those things are. And I know you know this as well, it's going to be different from person to person. It's going to be an expression, like somebody might have a genetic predisposition towards that being the outcome, whereas somebody else, they might have the same diet and their expression might be rheumatoid arthritis or migraines,
Right.
or whatever the case might be. But here's a thing for us to not glance over. When you mentioned a genetic similarity with folks, if we've got folks who have, the same quote gene, I don't even know why I said quote gene. Genes are not quotes, but more so I'm saying a gene for colitis, which that isn't just one thing. We also have to look at, these folks might have the same genes, but they very likely have the same diet. They very likely they're in the same environment. And so you don't just pass down your genes to your offspring, you also pass down your cookbook, or lack thereof.
Yeah.
And this is really
Yeah.
the
So
issue
true.
that we need to be talking more about. And so thank you so much for talking about this and kind of shedding a little bit of light on these issues. And it's top of mind for me because in my clinical practice, in the last maybe year before I just shifted to teaching and writing books, I had somebody come in, she was dealing with colitis for many years, and being able to see such relief and remission by making some changes to what she was doing. She didn't even know it was possible, and this isn't going to be the case for everybody. But if we could start to look at what are the factors that are underlying the condition, and it's not always food too. That's another thing about you that I admire.
Totally.
And I want to ask you about this, at least before I let you go, we got to talk about this. But what about stress? This isn't something that's talked about when it comes to the microbiome.
Yeah. No, I think this is a critically important point, and honestly, I'm glad that you brought it up because I feel like when we get outside of the nutrition space and we start talking lifestyle, we often focus on exercise and sleep. We might talk about meditation, but are we being real when it comes to talking about stress and what's going on in our subconscious? Because the most challenging patients that I take care of are not people who have complex digestive issues. The most challenging patients that I take care of, Shawn, are the people who have been the victim of abuse, trauma of some variety. That trauma leaves an imprint on their soul, on their subconscious. It's a wound, it's an open battle wound. And it's easy to ignore it because it's a lot easier to just avoid something that was traumatic and that hurt you and to not turn towards it, but instead to walk away from it. And the problem for these people that I've discovered, Shawn, and I think this is directly applicable to people that have inflammatory bowel disease, but I think it's directly applicable to everyone who has complex health issues. What I've discovered is that the solution to those issues is not to focus on your nutrition. The solution is actually to recognize that this traumatic event that occurred to you years ago, or this history of disordered eating and having an unhealthy relationship with your food, this is actually continuing to linger and cause problems. And it's important to turn your attention directly to it. And with the help of an appropriate care team, like let healthcare professionals who you trust, let us lift you up. But ultimately, you need to turn towards this problem and have a solution, have a plan to take it head on. Because when you fix that, when you actually heal the wound from that prior trauma or from that history of disordered eating, then actually true health follows shortly thereafter. And what I've seen is actually amazing recoveries in many of my patients who suffer and they never get better until you actually go and address this specific issue.
That's so powerful. So powerful. Just recently, I talked to a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Uma Naidu, a psychiatrist out of Harvard, but also brilliant specialization she has in nutrition. And she's created a department at one of the kind of offshoot hospitals there in Boston where they use nutritional therapy for psychiatric issues and also chronic diseases and the like. It's really great. And she shared with me that, and this was based on a study, this was published in BMC Microbiology, which I had the chance to go and look up after she shared it, that in the study we found that just 2 hours of psychological stress can create dramatic changes to the bacteria in your gut. And it's just like,
Yeah.
this stuff, scientists are asking these questions and the data exists. Our thoughts dramatically affect our biochemistry, which is of course going to affect our microbes instantaneously. And so if we're existing in this state of habitual chronic stress, which again, we talked about before the show, that people are just inundated with so much stress and worry and fear today. And,
Yeah.
largely in our society, we've got a lot of creature comforts. Like life is good. We don't typically have to worry about a mountain lion jumping on us, or we don't have to worry about a rival tribe. For the most part, there are some people, again, I come from an environment where there are some different sets in there, there's some
Right.
potential violence in the environment, but it's nothing like what our ancestors experienced. But they would experience those things in small peaks and then get back to baseline. Today, we just have this chronic, consistent fear, anxiety, worry that is just rampant in our culture. And we don't realize that that is deeply influencing our microbiome, which, as we've talked about multiple times today, is in many aspects, it is the garden from which our health is springing from. And so what is
Mhm.
the fertilizer? What is the thought fertilizer you're putting on that garden?
Yeah, I know. I think you're totally right. I think that, obviously we talked about some nutritional elements of things that can be done to try to grow that garden. We talked about eating a wide variety of different plants, focusing less on calories, focusing more on the varieties of plants in your diet, right? Start counting that. Um, but I do think that you make some great points, with regard to this specific topic of stress. And I would just speak for myself. I would be curious, like reach out to me on social media, the Gut Health MD, and tell me what you guys have found that's helpful for stress. I personally have found that I am a much happier person when I am not engaging with the craziness that's happening out there and the way that they want to whip me around with emotions and taking a break when I feel like I need it. Like, it doesn't mean that I'm completely disconnected. I haven't. But what I am saying is, like, don't allow this to consume your emotion. Check in when you need to check in, see what's going on out there. Recognize that they're trying to like whip you around, but like create distance and instead take that time and turn it towards things that bring you great happiness, like investing into yourself, investing into your relationships with other human beings. That's really what life is about. Like at the end of the day, these events that are occurring out there they're not going to actually determine who you are as a human being. You get to determine who you are, and it's your relationships that will make you happy. So, and there are actually, Shawn, some very interesting studies. Like you're bringing up some interesting studies. There are some very interesting studies on this topic where they look at shared microbiome among people that live in a shared place of dwelling, like shared residence. We start to take on microbial characteristics of one another, and they actually parsed this out a little bit further, and they looked at people who were in relationships and whether or not those relationships were like high quality loving relationships or whether it was like a damaged on the rocks type of situation. And they found that the people who were in these high quality loving relationships who had felt like they had good social support, their gut microbiome was far healthier than the ones who felt like they didn't have social support because they were in an unhealthy relationship at home. So like the science is emerging to confirm these suspicions that we have. Another quick one. They looked at kids and they looked at their stress response at school. Like how much does their cortisol, the stress hormone, spike? Mm-hmm. And what they found is that if that kid had their best friend at school with them that day, the cortisol barely spiked. But if their best friend was absent, they saw a massive spike in the cortisol. We're social creatures. We're meant to be connected to one another. And so it's important to embrace those connections. And, you know, you and I, we both have big social media accounts. But like, I would rather be in person with you in Los Angeles, having a conversation for real. You know what I mean? And I hope that one day we get to do that.
Oh, it's already done. It's already done. Hopefully it's going to happen when you got something really special that is about to happen. And this is the first podcast that you're making this announcement on. So tell folks about what you have coming up.
Oh, man, I am so excited. This is a big secret. This is a big secret that I've been holding close to my chest for a year and a half. With the success of Fiber Fueled, I felt like there was unfinished business. I wanted to keep going. I had people reaching out to me every single day. They wanted more. But for every single one of them, they're on their own unique journey. Not everyone is in the same place at the same time. You know, we're coming from different perspectives. And I wanted to create something that would help these people who are reaching out to me looking for the next step, the next level. And so I decided to create a cookbook, but not just any cookbook. I decided to create a cookbook that actually has a methodology embedded in it. Like I'm going to teach you exactly the process to help people fix their digestive health issues and reverse their food intolerances. Because I wanted to create like more recipes. I wanted 100 plus more recipes for people who want to keep following the path that I'm describing, who want to optimize their gut microbiome. I wanted that to be available, but I knew that that was a little bit of an exclusive thing because there are these people who sit in a room with me every single day in my clinic and they're not ready to eat that way. And I needed something that I could deliver to them that was for them specifically to help them. So yeah, this is crazy, man. I wasn't quite fully ready to announce, but here we are. We're going to announce this. The Fiber Fueled Cookbook is coming out in May of 2022, and it's available for pre-order right now through all the major outlets. And so for everyone who's out there, this book is for you. It has the recipes, it has the flavors, it has food from around the world. You're going to absolutely love the food. And no matter who you are, whether you have a healthy gut or whether you're trying to get a healthy gut, this book will help you on that journey. And so the Fiber Fueled Cookbook comes out May of 2022. Pre-order your copy now, and can't wait to share it with the world. Thank you,
Let's
Shawn.
go. As soon as I saw that book, true
Yeah, man.
story, my microbiome, my microbes, their attention perked up. You know, their little antennas went up. It's very beautiful, man. So beautiful. And
Yeah, man.
that's a big part of our experience with food is the aesthetic aspect as well. You know, we're not just, you know, flavor monsters, you know, contrary to popular belief, but eating is an experience. And the more joy we can bring into the process, the better. And so this is another resource to stack conditions in our favor. And, you know, you're one of my favorite people out here in this space. And, you know, this is such a great opportunity. I'm grateful that this is coming out in 2022 so we can make this a far healthier year for our families and communities and make sure that 2022 is not a repeat of 2022, you know, and that's really the goal. And so, you know, again, I'm just grateful for you. And, you know, I want everybody to definitely pop over, pre-order the book right now at all the major retailers, Amazon, we've got Barnes and Noble, but also do you have a website for folks to go?
Yeah, you can go to www.theplantfedgut.com. That's my website. I'm gonna have everything there. Ultimately, there will be a website at theplantfedgut.com/cookbook, and there's gonna be resources there. There's gonna be giveaways there. You pre-order this book, I'm gonna try to shower you with gifts if I can. And you know, you brought up an interesting point, Shawn. Food is supposed to be one of life's greatest pleasures. And it's something that most of us do 2 or 3 times a day. And I wanted to create something that allows everyone to enjoy their food the way that we all deserve to. That's where we all want to be.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today.
Angiogenesis, we talked about fruit peel to help endothelial cells stay healthy. Immune system, we talked about broccoli sprouts. Let's talk about regeneration, stem cells. It turns out that cacao, dark chocolate,